All right, hello everyone. Today is April 2nd, 2020. This is the code organization subproject under SIG Architecture. I'm Andrew and I will be moderating today. Let me share my screen with the agenda. So I was actually in the middle of putting the first item in. Let me just finish that. Yeah, so quick update on, George and I both working in testing common subproject. We had a quick sync up on Monday and we decided that moving the testing framework to staging is going to be the highest priority thing we do for 119. Initially, what we were trying to do was we were trying to clean up the framework first and then move it to staging. But that work that work kind of stalled. And I don't think at this point there's much value in trying to clean up the code there. I think we should just do the move to staging as is first. And that way, whoever's pulling in our E2E testing framework can at least benefit from not having to pull in KK. And then once we do that, we can have a broader discussion around how we want to clean up the code in there. But at least that's what we decided. I wanted to get feedback from the group and see if that priority makes sense.
Did you talk about trade-off between staging and actually moving it out and vendoring it back in?
My assumption is that like vendoring is going to be a real pain for unless we have the actual like E2E tests out too. Like it doesn't make sense to vendor it. I think staging makes sense because I'm sure like changes to the framework will be really coupled to people who are writing the tests, but that was just my opinion. But that was the biggest reason.
The other way to look at it was what were the changes under these directories that were not related to refactoring for the last 6 months or a year? Do you know if there was lots of changes happened here?
I mean, hard to say. Like, there's a lot of stuff in there.
Hey, Dims, if it touches anything under the API or the client, then we can't vendor it in.
Okay.
Because that would refer to staging repos. So
right. Okay.
Who are the target consumers of this as a published staging repository?
Yeah, so we definitely know CSI uses this in some repos, like they pull in this framework to run their own E2E suite. And it was actually Patrick from Intel working on CSI that actually asked for this feature first. But then also some folks at VM are working on Sonoboy. They run a bunch of E2E suites for conformance, for the conformance suite. And there's been pains pulling in KK for that as well. And also like the provider, like the cloud, we still have cloud provider dependencies in there. And so I figured we want those pulled out. And because we want the E2E separate anyways, like one like middle step between getting the provider's code out of the framework could be like, let's stage the framework to make it easier for providers to run E2E suites on their external repositories. And that kind of is an easier transition to remove the provider dependency in the framework. That makes sense. I didn't word that the best.
I'm not actually seeing how that helps remove the provider dependency. Maybe
so the actual motivation is like we want the provider specific tests living in the provider specific repos, and by staging the framework, we make it easier for the providers to import the existing framework from KK, and just like import whatever the staging repo, the external staging repo is, and just use that the exact same framework for their E2E suite without having to duplicate whatever provider framework is in KK.
But as soon as, so the framework currently has cloud provider dependencies.
Yes.
If we publish that and then people start using that with its provider dependencies, won't that make it harder to drop the provider dependencies from the framework? I guess I'm not following the order of operations where at the end we don't have provider dependencies from the framework.
Yeah, that's a good point. I haven't thought of that. My assumption was that it's better to have one source of where it comes from. So like stage it and keep one source of truth versus having like providers updating the framework internally and having a copy of it externally. But yeah, I haven't thought about it being harder to remove once there's more consumers of it. My assumption is that if there's consumers of it, they're already doing it through KK. So there's not much difference if we stage it, but maybe that's wrong.
Are the uses like in utility methods that would be reasonable for an individual provider to just copy a utility method to their own test suite, or is it like buried inside like a bunch of layers where a common utility method that a bunch of tests use behaves differently if it's running in a cloud?
Both.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are like specific, there's like specific utility functions that there's like a switch based on the provider. So that's hard to remove. But then also like there's, like it's generically useful just for like standing up the suite. So yeah, it's both.
Okay. As soon as we move it to a place where people can reasonably import it, they will start reasonably importing it. And it's a harder case to make that just ripping out function entirely from a component we published and said, hey, you can use this and depend on this. It's harder to make the case that that's okay to just drop.
Yeah, like one thing we could do instead is like we can stage the framework and keep the provider plugins in tree, and then tell all the providers to move that package, like the testing framework package, into their external repositories, and then we can import it from there. But at least keep the actual like the cloud provider interface in there so that other providers can just import that the staging repo and then import their own framework from there.
Okay. If like I know there's a lot of things that could be done to clean up the testing framework, like a lot of things. If the thing we're specifically focused on is isolating cloud provider dependencies, that seems like it would be better to do to figure out how that will be structured and do that before we publish the framework for use. Like we don't have to clean up everything about the framework. But listing those dependencies in particular, just off the top of my head, like it seems like it might work to have a package for each provider, or like here's test framework things, either helper methods or things that inject cloud specific behavior. And then the places in the framework where we're currently making calls out to clouds, like we have a way for you to, from the outside, inject that behavior to say, hey, I'm a cloud and like I know how to get labels for nodes, or I know how to identify my masters, or I know how to, like whatever the random things are that we're doing inside the framework that are cloud specific. That like pulling those bits out could be done in place, and then moving just the E2E framework stuff to its own thing, and moving the cloud specific things, maybe even under legacy cloud providers. Like that one already has all of these crazy dependencies.
Yeah,
like
that makes sense.
If you have like legacy cloud providers / GCE / E2E helpers or whatever the sub package is, something like that would make it a lot clearer, like where those dependencies are. And then the cloud provider could use the EDE component and import the helpers thing. And then those two things, let them get what they need to run externally.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So first we should make sure that any call into the provider framework is done through an interface, and then make sure that, and then when we do the move to staging, we're not moving it along with the provider packages. We're just gonna move that into wherever the cloud provider specific repos are, and then yeah, just those two. Is that what you were saying pretty much?
Yeah, like untangle the cloud provider bits before we publish the EDE component.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Is SIG testing on board with publishing the EDE framework?
I'm not so sure that we are. We haven't had a substantial discussion about this. So I was going to propose, like, this is a large enough change that it needs to go through the CAP process.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
I know it's been a lot of piecemeal, like refactoring and untangling of things, but this is a pretty big step.
Yeah, like so splitting out the packages, I would be on board with. We could do that as is, but actually like publishing it and saying like, this is a thing that you should pull in and use externally this way, like that's a bigger commitment. So
okay, so yeah, to be clear, like this is work that Tim St. Clair was driving when he was a SIG chair, and yeah, I understand that he stepped down a while back, so maybe whoever.
Yeah, I've seen testing comments kind of continue on, but like if this is going to be a thing you're actually pushing for, it should be done in the context of a CAP. I think Jordan enumerated a bunch of things you would put in that CAP for like what your plan is going forward. But we should definitely talk about supportability of this, because today, I don't think there's anybody really owning or maintaining this framework. Like SIG testing has it because a lot of the people who used to be in SIG testing helped write it back in the day, but it's not really actively maintained and used anymore. As Jordan said, there's lots we could do to fix it.
Right, but then I would at least say that we should figure out a way to do the cloud provider stuff.
Totally.
Even if we don't do the rest of the things in a CAP format.
Yes, I feel like Ben ran into this when he did the CAP around making cloud provider agnostic builds. So that might be some good stuff for you to dig into.
Yeah, like the scenario I was trying to avoid, and maybe it's premature, was that like it's painful for cloud providers to import KK already when they import the cloud controller manager. And I didn't want to get to a situation where like they finally don't depend on KK for the CCM, but then they want to run EDE test suite and then they import the framework and then they're back to importing KK. And so that's why I wanted to do the move to staging ahead of time, so that when they import both the testing framework and the cloud controller manager framework, that they're both staged. But yeah, there's a good point. Like I'll talk to George and we'll see if we'll have the bandwidth to put together a CAP.
I'd be curious what the uses of the EDE framework are. Like I had actually thought it was moving more in the direction of being agnostic to the cluster it was running on. So like you bring up a cluster, however it is, and then you run the EDE suite against it. This seems to be more returning to the like, oh yeah, the guts of the EDE test, like know all these intimate details about the cluster and like the environment. And so like that kind of didn't match what I thought the direction was.
I don't follow. So like the framework does all the Ginkgo and Gomega setup for you, right? And then you just tell it like, look at these packages for where all my tests are. Like put it like, and then it has a bunch of utilities for like, you know, managing clients and checking nodes and all that stuff. So like that's all that stuff. Like we don't want the cloud providers, when they go ahead and add their specific tests, we don't want them rewriting all that.
I guess I'm not understanding what, so the helper functions for like wait for this deployment and like start a pod and run a pod, like we can publish EDE helper functions without, you know, doing all of the test setup. Like you don't need cloud specific anything to wait for a pod to be ready and wait for a deployment to be ready. And like you don't need anything cloud specific for those things. Most of the cloud specific stuff that I was aware of was around like wait for this instance, like go check metadata and wait for this instance, or if I'm on AWS, then my masters are named this way, and so that had much more to do with sort of the cluster setup. And
so there's two kinds of tests that I've been seeing, like the one you just described, where you need to verify like specific behavior in that platform. But then there's also like generic tests for Kubernetes that depend on external action that only certain cloud providers can do. So like kill a node to test if a node, you know, if we're handling like nodes going down properly, things like that.
I see.
So that's the main reason why we're trying to do this, because we may have common tests that are repeated across the different provider repos if they want to test. Like one classic example is like if a node gets deleted, then the cloud provider goes ahead and deletes the underlying instance. If an instance is terminated, then Kubernetes goes ahead and deletes the corresponding node resource, right? So
how is this tested with external cloud provider?
So we have one test that's not run anywhere. So we have actually a cloud, like a Ginkgo feature for cloud specific behaviors. So I don't think any external providers do that today, but what we want them to do is pull in the framework, like find wherever that external package is for the cloud specific EDB behaviors, and then they would pull that into their own repositories and then kick it off as part of CI.
Okay. All right, that's helpful to understand.
Do you have to use the E2E framework?
I think so. I mean, it'd be asking a lot for everyone working on the cloud providers to adopt a new framework.
I just feel like there's going to be a substantial amount of work involved in like even lifting and shifting this. Possibly it may be worth comparing the amount of work that's going to involve with the amount of work it would take to write something that's cleaner and more well suited towards cloud providers' purposes.
I think Clayton had a comment. See if I can find it.
I mean, I could, yeah, while Jordan does that, we can definitely look into it. But my gut feeling is that because one of the use cases is running the current suite of tests, which heavily depend on the framework in the like cloud provider specific repos, like I don't think that adopting a new thing is going to be doable. But I'd have to dig deeper to give you a firm answer on that.
Yeah, I think like definitely a good place to start would be a list of the tests that are requiring cloud provider specific behavior. You know, yeah.
What was it? Oh, his was targeted specifically at like the EDE test manifests.
But so for example, like one random thought would be, why, if there was a cloud provider interface that all the cloud providers had to implement for things like deleting nodes and whatnot, that the E2E framework could import.
Sorry.
But don't you need a raw implementation somewhere, which would then bring your imports?
Yeah, but I'm trying to figure out how this could simplify Andrew's problem of there needing to be some way of capturing the in-tree providers code right now.
So, I mean, you could, in theory, move all the cloud provider specific code like into an internal package, and then only allow, like basically create an entry point for all of that functionality in each of like a higher level exposed endpoint, and that would sort of force it, I think, at a compile time. I think you could probably do that. that will at least force you to isolate dependencies in a way that you couldn't break, I think. Maybe. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not, but you still have all the depths around, but you basically force that whatever interface that you come up to be complete. Like it has to have every bit of functionality, because you can't go into like a cloud specific folder and try to use it, because it just won't compile.
Right.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, like in case it wasn't clear and it should have stayed from the beginning, like there already is an interface, and there's already those implementations of it in Tree.
Okay.
So yeah. It's just a matter of making it available and then making it easier for external cloud providers to implement that and then run it against whatever suite they have.
Is it E2E test specific interface, or is this the cloud interface?
I'm talking specifically the EDB specific interface.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, making sure it's through an interface is a good step. If we already have one, making sure that's complete and nothing else leaked out around the edges, so that everything the EDE framework currently does goes through this interface or an interface. I think the question about extracting the framework for use has more to do with what Aaron was saying about like supportability of it long term, and if like what is our plan for people to run EDE tests? Is it to take our full EDE suite and then layer on or inject their own implementation of this interface and then build an EDE test binary and then run that? And yeah, if so, like how much work is involved in getting what we have today in a consumable format for that?
I guess a thought we could try to, I don't see anyone from Red Hat on the call, but I do know that OpenShift runs the conformance suite with a bunch of OpenShift stuff on top with a OpenShift-test binary. I don't know if like that like helps anything. Like certainly I know OpenShift already has KK dependencies, so I don't think they care about that. But I don't know if there's something we can learn from that approach to help others, because I think the requirement there was run the entire Cube conformance suite plus like a bunch of OpenShift stuff as one binary.
I just know there's a lot of things built into the EDE framework today around like cluster bring up that make it really complicated.
It has a lot of assumptions around the use of the wonderful bash scripts inside of the cluster directory, right?
It's a much more straightforward mode, and this is how like kind runs, right? Like kind starts a cluster, and then it runs the EDE test against a cluster that's already up and just says, like, here's a client credential, like here's how you talk to the cluster, run your tests. That really cleanly separates like who's responsible for setting up the cluster that you're going to be testing, and then what are the tests that you're running.
But in kind, that means you can't necessarily have a test that relies on infrastructure level functionality, right? Like Andrew had mentioned, like the ability to kill a node in some same way.
So right now in our framework, we've got like cluster setup and teardown stuff, plus tests, plus cloud-specific implementations for infrastructure triggering events that happen during the tests. And so I'm hesitant to just take everything we have and dump it out to be consumed while all of the setup teardown stuff is still like tangled in there.
Yeah, and I think this is where one of my assumptions was wrong, is that people are already importing it from KK regardless. And so my assumption was that we should just stage it if they're going to do that anyways.
See, the word provider in the test framework kind of doubles for both cloud provider and also cluster provider. Like you guys were talking about, like how do we tear down nodes and stuff? That's kind of maybe more cluster provider specific, but how does the cloud, magically bring nodes back? That's up to the cloud provider.
Okay, can we time box this?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
near term, like making sure we have the provider dependencies enumerated and making sure there's no direct references to providers from the framework. It's all through these implementations. And then kind of writing out what's being proposed would be the next 2 steps.
Yeah, sounds good. I will sync up with George and Aaron and figure out next steps.
Yeah, the related question I had before we wrap up is, do you have enough hands to do this work?
So it depends on the scope. Like from my discussions before with George and Tim, if we were gonna just move it as is, I don't think it's that much work because it's just a matter of like shifting code around to make the dependencies not depend on KK.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're gonna have to change up the framework to cover everything we just discussed, then it might take longer than one release, given that it's just me and George working on this.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Next item, HCS shim update.
Okay.
You Dims?
Yes. So part of the thing that we were trying to update in during the last cycle was the combination of HCS shim, containerd, and C advisor. So we got the containerd and the C advisor done, and the HCM shim had a similar problem with the C advisor where it was dragging in a bunch of dependencies that actually the usage of HCS shim as a library was not using. So it turns out that they were doing a lot of Go dependencies just for their test framework, which was unrelated to how we use HCS shim as a library. So I proposed a split, multiple Go mod in their repository, and that got accepted by them. So as a result, in the root Go mod file in HCS shim, that has come down quite significantly, and it is kind of like ready for us to use. So this PR was updated to prototype and make sure that we don't drag in anything else. There's like one package that gets added, but other than that, it looks really good. I requested them to cut a release, and whoever I was talking to promised to get back to me in a few days. So that's the update on this. So when that gets done, we'll be able to update this dependency and without taking on a bunch of Go mods that we don't use.
Yeah, I was glad to see how this turned out. Thanks for taking that up too.
So then the next one was the CRI split. So this was let me say where I started. So where I started was in containerd repository, there is a lot of cross dependency between containerd and containerd CRI. So I was trying to research how to break the chain there. And one of the things that stood out was the CRI API use, because we have two other. It's not just the CRI API, it's also the usage of K8s.io. Some of the repositories in K8s.io is being used in containerd. So that was complicating the situation there. But then if you look at Cryo or if you look at HCS shim, they were not using K8s Kubernetes as extensively as is being done in the containerd repositories. So cleaning up the container repository, containerd is a slightly more difficult problem. But while we were researching all the options that are available. Another thing that stood out was, do we need to break a CRI API from staging into its own repository and get us to vendor it in instead of it being staged? So that was one of the threads that came out of that analysis. And the thing that is stopping us from actually doing that is because that's not enough. Just breaking the CRI API is not enough, because there is a streaming package in kubelet, kubelet/server/streaming, that is also being used by various people. And there is a KEP also. There is a, can you go back to the doc and click on the KEP for the streaming library, Andrew? So this was the other problem that we, that we will face, because the people who are using CRI API end up using the streaming library as well. So they essentially need both. They need the CRI API and the streaming library. And then if you scroll down to the bottom, there is discussion there about, okay, we need to actually not publish the streaming API, streaming library as such. We should fold that into gRPC based, handshake by adding stuff into the CRI API itself. So that basically puts the ball back in the court of SIG to see if they want to take this on at some point. So at this point, I'm going to stop doing this. Stop looking at the CRI API and streaming. Leave it up to SIG for them to think about what they want to do, and if they want to rev the CRI API, because updating the CRI API gets into other sorts of discussions where, is the current CRI API is enough? What does it not support? And there is like a sandbox API that is being proposed in another forum. So it gets into those kinds of details. So I'm basically trying to put a closure on this work and say, okay, I'm not going to touch this anymore than we already have.
This is a GA API?
It's V1 alpha. This CRI API is V1 alpha. If you look at the directory, it says V1 alpha.
I swear I saw something about them moving to beta during a release long, long ago. But okay,
yes,
good to know.
It hasn't happened yet. So basically pause this work and do something which is going to be more useful, for everybody. I think I can go to the next one. Right, the next one, since Lubomir is here, can we talk a little bit about how far you got, Lubomir, with the SIG release and with the Kubadium?
I need to update the Kipnis Cycle because the Kip is out of date.
Okay.
And then I need to ping SIG release again for a new review. And hopefully we can move this in 1.19.
Did they tell you to change what is being proposed here? Is that?
Yes, partially.
And is there, what was their feedback?
The feedback is that we don't want to touch Anago. So if SIG architecture wants to move Kubadium as soon as possible, we have to touch Anago, and they don't want to do that. So basically, we have to provide an alternative. So I'm going to change this proposal. The alternative is to build Kubadium from KK instead of building it from Anago.
Build Kubadium from KK. What does that mean?
Pretty much cloning Kubadium from the new repository,
okay,
and executing a build. So after the build is done, we can take the binary artifacts and place them in the old locations.
So are you saying that the make files and the builds, the helper shell scripts and Bazel snippets will actually do, will get the latest SHA of KubeADM from another GitHub repository when the builds are executed?
Something like that.
Okay. So did you also talk about vendoring in KubeADM?
I think a couple of times already we said that we cannot do that on this meeting.
Yeah, you
Okay.
can't do that.
Right. No, I was just asking whether that was also talked about or not.
I don't think they have an opinion on vendoring.
Okay. So it's up to you to provide a choice. Okay.
So one potential problem here is, do we consider the Kubernetes build hermetic or rather air-gapped?
Some of the decisions that we made around vendoring were because we currently do. Yeah, I know some environments build without expecting things to get pulled from the network. I'm not sure about like the official CI Kubernetes make or Bazel builds.
So I feel like there's another less satisfactory option, which is you are free to pull KubeADM out into its own repo and just not be included as part of the regular Kubernetes release. Because today, the Kubernetes release doesn't include anything that's not from the KK repo. So that wouldn't block you from moving the repo out. It just means you haven't, like, whoever goes first, be it cloud providers or KubeADM, or if we one day got CRI providers extracted out, right? Like, how would we package all of that into a release? Has yet to be started.
Right. CRI providers aren't packaged today, right? Like they reference artifacts outside that exist out in the world. Same for network plugins.
Right, Jordan. I think one question there was like, if we split out the Docker shim into a separate binary, would we then include it? I don't know. That was the kind of thought process my head went into.
I mean, I've said for a long time that letting KubeADM have a release cadence independent from Kubernetes makes a lot of sense. There have been many releases where something was discovered, the day of release, and in something like a KubeADM conf file, right? And it didn't actually require any changes to any Kubernetes binaries or any artifacts.
Right.
All it was a install configuration, but it required scrambling an entire Kubernetes point release to rev an installer tool. Rather than doing a lot of work to try to figure out how to pull KubeADM out, but then let its release remain coupled to the Kubernetes release, I actually see it as a benefit to let KubeADM release on whatever cadence it wants, to let it react much quicker and faster to bugs or features or things that need to be done independent of the Kubernetes release.
Right. That was my first instinct too, Jordan. In fact, that's what I mentioned to Lubomir a long time ago, saying it's a deployer. It just deploys Kubernetes. It should have its own cadence. You can like make a release on the same day as Kubernetes to support the latest Kubernetes. So it doesn't need to be. But then the question that comes back to us is maybe not this sub-project itself, would be like how many people expect KubeADM to be present in their workflow from the packages that we publish, right? And I don't know how much of a hassle it is for everybody to pull Kuberium from somewhere else from other than us. Lubomir, do you want to explore that option as well instead of exploring the option of vendoring versus updating Bazel and having some brittle stuff here?
We could potentially delay the split until SIG release decide to build Kuberium from Anago, because to my understanding, a lot of people, including SIG release today, want to continue bundle Kuberium as part of the release turbos.
Do they say why they want to do it? Just because we do it before doesn't mean that we should continue to do it, right?
I think SIG release just don't want to break people if we discontinue this artifact. On the Kuberium maintainer side, we just want to make our lives easier by having this release schedule coupled, and also not having this separate compatibility matrix with Kubernetes. But there are reasons. Now, if we want to discontinue the artifact itself, I already proposed this to SIG release, but they said, no, we should continue. So I can have this discussion with them again. But if you don't want to clone...
Maybe we need to take this up the chain a little bit, right? Because you already had the same discussions with them. You already had the discussions here. So maybe we take it to SIG Arch or something like that.
A question for SIG Arch in particular is, what do you want to do with other components in the future once we continue splitting the monoliths? Like, should we do the same decoupling with the kubelet or API server? So what is going to be a Kubernetes version then?
Right. The difference is this is a clean split, right? There is no dependency on the code. The only dependency is it lives in the same tree. Other than that, there is literally nothing that binds Kuberium to Kubernetes. The rest of the binaries, have some sort of dependency, or they have to be brought up in a certain order, or they depend on each other because they call each other. There are other things there, right? So Kuberium, like literally nobody else needs it in the K repository.
It seems like maybe the best balance point is to let kubeatom have its own release cadence and have some way to indicate, like, this is the current stable release of kubeatom, and then as part of the Kubernetes release process, we can continue to bundle the current stable release of kubeatom. And that could work for kubeatom, it could work for kubectl, it could work for several of these tools that are wanting to be able to iterate more rapidly. And that way, if kubeatom needs to make additional releases, it can do a 118.01, 118.02, 118.03, 118.04, 118.05, whatever. It could do multiple of those on a daily basis if it wanted to. And then 2 weeks later, when Kubernetes does its, every 2 week or 1 month release, it would pick up whatever the current stable release of kubeatom is. That decouples like the build release processes, but still gets the benefits of bundling. So people who are affected by a kubeatom bug, the day of release, you can report it to kubeatom, you can fix it, you can get a patch release out, they can update and get their problem fixed. People who don't particularly care about a particular issue can just continue consuming stuff from the mega bundle.
Okay, so the feedback there is how do I say it? Do not aim to build KubeADM when Kubernetes is getting built, right? The thing that needs package Kubernetes should pull whatever version it needs, however you want to do it at a binary level instead of trying to do a build.
At an artifact level, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I would go back to SIG release with and say, like, and KubeADM isn't the only one that we're going to want to do this with. Kube control is going to be similar. So starting to think of a way to indicate in maybe in the Kubernetes repo, or like when we do a Kubernetes release, what are the artifacts we pull in? And it could be as simple as a manifest that points to like KubeADM latest stable, kube control latest stable, whatever it is, and the release process goes and pulls in those artifacts. And there might be multiple ones for different architectures. Like, and this is for SIG release to think through and think about what they would need in the Kubernetes repository to represent this, and what they would need from the destination repositories. But
right, Lubomir, then basically what you are telling those SIG release folks is, okay, we're going to pull the repository out. We're going to have our own independent processes in KubeADM repository for putting out releases. And they can choose if they are so insistent on bundling KubeADM with Kubernetes, they can do the work to pull in whichever version they want and package it. So that's the split of responsibility.
Ideally, the release processes for these independent components would be very lightweight. It would be like run a release script, and you get a tag and artifacts, and maybe update a pointer text file that says this is the latest stable release.
Yeah, we do this for all the others, right? Like cluster API, CSI. So it's not something new.
Yeah, the goal is not to take the heavyweight Kubernetes process and push it out to these other repos. It's to give them their own really lightweight ones that produce exactly the minimal artifacts required, like a tag and the artifacts for every architecture, and then let the Kubernetes process consume that.
I've seen the heavy process being applied to multiple repositories, like modules in a different big project as a wider distribution. So all the modules follow the same versioning. So this is not something new. I think I have a general question. Do you think that the own versioning cadence of kubectl is going to confuse the consumers further?
People already use different versions of kubectl to access different versions of Kube API server. People don't necessarily match exactly the version of a kubectl and API server.
Yes, they're already confused. That's what.
Right. And that problem doesn't apply to KubeADM because KubeADM is like a one-time thing. And they run it when they start a cluster. After that, they don't use it, right?
I mean, KubeADM has opinions about what versions of Kubernetes it can be used to set up. So I think it matters somewhat. Yeah, what versions you can use to set up and what versions you can upgrade from. So there's some care that has to be taken there to make sure that you're using the right version.
Yeah, we would need a version matrix for sure.
I think a big part of what this will reveal is that our version compatibility testing is actually currently very weak or non-existent. And so we work around the problem by like build it all from the same tree and everything at the same commit works great together. But if you drift at all, like, do we test that? Sometimes, not always. And sometimes we do test it and then we ignore the results. And so I I think we already have this problem. This will make it more visible and hopefully make it
Then
more
we'll fix it.
reasonable to
Yeah.
run. So it's actually hard to run a test job against a different version of Kubernetes from within the Kubernetes repo. It's more reasonable. Like if the component that I'm testing, like kubecontrol or kubeatom, has to make a choice about what version of this external thing it's going to test against, then that makes you structure your tests in a way that recognizes this thing over here is a different thing, and I need to pick a version of it to test with. And once you have a script where you can pick a version of this other thing to test with, you can pick the current version, or you can pick the n-1 version, or the n-2, or if you're kubecontrol, n-3 or 4, or like, whereas all the test scripts that are in Kubernetes today, not all of them, but the majority of them don't even have any concept of the last version. It's just, this is the code in the repo and I'm going to test it. And so recognizing that this is a client and that is a server and they're not always at the same version, it's a lot easier to recognize that when the client and the server are actually different components that are built differently and have to pick the version of the other one that they test with.
Right. The more we talk about it, more I feel that this is the right thing to do.
It is. We just need to have our eyes open to, like, this is the work that has to be done to actually make sure this gets tested and works. I mean, it's gaps that we have today. It's not worse, but we can't magically decouple these and expect things to just continue the way they have been if we don't close those gaps.
I guess I'm kind of caught on, like, maybe it's a circular or downstream dependency thing. Let's say that kubeadm and kubectl depend on some things in like API and API machinery and stuff like that. It feels like I have no guarantee that I'm going to be using the v1.18 version of those staging libraries unless I wait for Kubernetes to be released, and then I release afterwards. So it introduces a bit of latency. Otherwise, I'm going to be depending on something that probably a few commits.
I don't think we rely on the API as such, but we do rely, the kubeadm relies on the component config of different binaries. And that has settled down. For the longest time, that was drifting for every release, and that has settled down now.
Or we can release kubeadm without a security fix that is already in staging in KK. If we release preemptively with a tag in kubeadm, you know, the security fix might come later in staging.
Yeah, so Aaron, you're saying if the 1.18.0 tag gets released, and at that moment we slurp in kubecontrol and kubeadm, like the current stable versions, and release them as well, then the 1.18 release artifacts, by definition, will have a kubecontrol and a kubeadm that were built against a pre-1.18.0 version of the API libraries and
Correct.
API machinery and all that. Yes, that, to me, that means that the 1.18.0 code is distinct from the release artifacts. Like, once we have a tested level and we say this is the Kubernetes code that's going to be 1.18.0, like that gets tagged, like the git tag gets added, all the libraries get published, like the code is fixed. We have not released the release artifacts yet.
Okay.
And then the things that we say are so important that they have to be included in the Kubernetes artifacts. Like, I think that list should be small. Like, we shouldn't be, as a matter of course, pulling in additional components. Those things are on the hook to build against the 1.18.0 libraries and tag a stable version that includes those libraries, and then we can release. I don't see any way to guarantee that those versions of the libraries round trip all the way through those external components.
And that makes sense. So it'll introduce some additional latency in the overall release process.
The Kubernetes release process.
Yeah. If they want to bundle KubeADM. But given all this stuff, they might not want to bundle KubeADM.
Well, I guess I'm thinking of it more from a kubectl perspective. Like
right.
I, as a consumer, would definitely want the V118 version to talk to the V118 version.
Exactly. Right. Yeah.
So we're short on time. Is there an action item I should write down for the KubeADM work?
So Lubomir, run this idea by SIG release. If they don't like it, let's escalate it to architecture, and we'll get a larger discussion between all the other SIGs too.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Cool. Anything else last minute that we need to touch base on? All right. See you all in 2 weeks.
Bye.
Bye. Stay safe.